Welcome to the 2021 D&J Seeds Winter Agronomy Update number 8. Today we're going to concentrate specifically on white mold and soybeans. I've talked a little bit in some of the past videos about white mold on the seed treatment side and things like that, but today we're really going to deep dive into kind of some risk factors, some cultural management practices, and some chemical control practices. We're not going to be able to hit everything. This is a pretty complex disease, but I'm going to try to get through as much stuff as I can just so that hopefully everybody will take a little bit from this and maybe come up with some more questions to ask. So the main risk factors for white mold and soybeans, number one being geography. So we're lucky enough in the northern part of the United States to have cool July and August are cooler than the southern part of the United States, which also increases our incidence of white mold. The geography kind of goes hand in hand with climate, so those cooler months late in summer are what really drive this disease to propagate in the soybeans. And then field topography, fields that have low-lying areas or sloped side hills that don't get a lot of wind can have more issues, or fields that have tree lines or large groves next to them can have areas that are protected from wind, so the canopy doesn't get dried out, which can cause more instance of disease. Field history plays a big part of white mold. High fertility fields that have a long history of manure or a lot of commercial fertilizer tend to be higher risk to white mold. Also, fields that have had a history of the actual disease, it's pretty predictable. The sclerotia can survive in the soil up to 10 years. So I think 2017 was a really severe year locally for white mold. So we still have white mold in the soil. It's just will we have the right environment to have incidence of white mold. So cultural practices for white mold control. I'll go through these: variety selection, tillage practices, limiting canopy density, crop rotation, and weed management. I won't spend as much time on all of them, but I'll just kind of hit the ones that I think are the most important. I did rank them in order of importance, if you're wondering how that's laid out there. So the number one tool for white mold control is variety selection. Number one. A couple things to understand about variety selection, and specifically scores between companies, is those scores are not universal, so they're very subjective. So like in Pioneer's scoring system, anything a 5 or above is pretty good. 6 would be exceptional. 21A 28, 18A 33, 18A 98, 16A 84. Those are all 6s for white mold, which are pretty much the universal or the industry standard soybeans for white mold resistance. If you get a 5 or better, that's pretty good on white mold. Other companies are their scoring is different. They might go from descending to ascending order, or just their protocols for what they consider an average to good soybean is different than from company to company. So just be aware of that. One thing too, I'll put a shout out for the E3 soybeans is what's very exciting is for the beans we're testing this year and we'll have for sale next fall. We have 4 varieties that are very good fits for our geography that will have a white mold score of a 5 or greater, which is excellent. No-till. I know this is kind of sacrilege for some people to talk about no-till, but no-till is extremely effective in controlling white mold. What happens is you break up the life cycle of that disease. So if you have basically, think of it as almost like a weed seed. So those white mold spores, they'll emerge in standing corn, but they won't have a host. So they kind of just die off and then won't reemerge the next year. Anything that does emerge, you create a physical barrier with a lot of trash or residue on the surface. So when you have rainfall, it's not splashing on the soil, splashing those spores up into the flowers of the soybean plant, and it decreases your potential for white mold that way. No-till also creates a shorter plant height in the soybeans, even though they might most of the time yield exactly the same. Typically those plant heights are a lot shorter. And another thing I bring up to people who really struggle with white mold but aren't willing to go the no-till route is I would maybe consider variable tillage. If you've got areas of the field, low-lying areas around groves or side hills that typically are just brutal for white mold, consider picking up the ripper or the chisel plow in those areas and just no-tilling through those spots. A lot of the modern planters now have all downforce you can control from the cab, so you'll have to do a little tweaking, but it's something I think could help in some cases. So weed management. So there's 400 species, I believe, or over 400 species of broadleaf weeds that actually are host plants to white mold. So common ragweed, lamb's quarter, water hemp, kind of the big three in our area, are all able to have white mold, or they'll actually get infected with white mold. So if you have weedy fields, weedy bean fields especially, that'll add to your canopy density and create areas of white mold in the field. Or in cases where you have drown out spots in cornfields or where there's really thick weed patches, there's probably going to be white mold in those areas that's going to survive and be in that field for the next year's rotation back to soybeans. Row width 15 versus 30. So I kind of go round and round with this, and really it's not about the width of the row, narrow rows versus 30. It's more about the canopy density. So actually the worst white mold incidents I've seen have been in 30-inch rows because the density between plants is so much greater than 15. So if you have, say, 140,000 seeded population in 15-inch rows versus 30s, those plants are a lot closer together in 30-inch rows versus 15s. I know some people will disagree with me, but just from what I've seen out in the field, walking across different row widths, I actually see less incidence of white mold in 15-inch rows with reduced population than I have in 30s. So crop rotation, it does help. Crop rotation away from soybeans, but understand that those sclerotia can survive in the soil up to 10 years. So if you had severe white mold in the past, chances are you can get it again. So just something to be aware of. I'll kind of move on to chemical approaches to controlling white mold and approach fungicide, which is labeled for white mold control, and it's relatively inexpensive as far as fungicides go. A 9-ounce rate of approach, which would be a pretty high rate, is going to set you back probably $17 to $18 per application. But this was a study done along with the University of Wisconsin with approach at different stages and with and without manganese. So one thing interesting is this manganese and approach kind of yield bump here, and this is something I'm very interested in trying to see if manganese can help kind of up the ante with some of these fungicides, because you can see manganese by itself actually underperformed the untreated check, but along with the fungicide really improved those yield levels. So and then this table kind of shows incidence of white mold, so you can see the two different shots of approach. So the top one, the top one is 1 9-ounce shot of approach at R3, and the bottom one is two applications of approach at R1 and R3. So some pretty good yield results there. So this is from 2017, so this is one of our internal crop insights. This was done in Wisconsin and Nebraska, I believe. So basically taking 2 applications versus 1 application of approach. So 2 9-ounce applications versus 1 9-ounce application. So, and you can see kind of in this photo, the R1, R3 application versus the untreated check. You can definitely see visual response to white mold in both locations. And you do get some, if you're someone that's doesn't think that they have, or doing other measures that maybe will limit white mold, it is possible that just a single 9-ounce approach would be beneficial. But in those really high severity fields, 2 shots is your best option. So right after I get done talking about 2 shots of 9 ounces, we do see sometimes some good control. I think it's more timing critical to the base application of approach. So the base rate of approach that picks up all your main foliar diseases in soybeans is just 6 ounces. It's when you bump it up to the 9 or 2 9-ounce shots that you start to see white mold control. But in this instance, this was out in Volga, South Dakota in 2018. This field was actually split in half. And you can see there's pretty, 21A28, which is, like I said, a kind of an industry standard for white mold resistance, an 8 bushel difference. And you can see physical white mold out in this check strip. Let's see, this is from a couple years ago, so some of these soybeans are a little long in the tooth, but let's look at 15A63, very good soybean for a long time, and you can see 6 ounces approach, looks pretty clean, added 14.4 bushel versus the untreated check, and you can see pockets of white mold. So your last line of defense for white mold in soybeans, this is heads up seed treatment we'll be offering this spring. I'd like to see people, this is kind of a tool you use when you've already selected a variety that's tolerant and you're doing other cultural practices to limit white mold, but need just a little extra protection. This is kind of where you go to get that. You don't. Heads up isn't meant to take a really poor scoring white mold bean and make it a very good one. It's basically trying to bump that score maybe 1 point level. So if you have fields that you've planted 21A28s in the past, which is an awesome soybean for white mold, and you've pulled back on your population and done other things, but you still get white mold in that field, then this is where you maybe look at using a heads up. Or if it's a field where you don't typically have white mold, but you're planting a bean that's has good iron corrosis characteristics, but the white mold score isn't as good, maybe this is a product you put in there to kind of try to bump that score up a little bit. So one thing I'll say before wrapping up with white mold today is, we're on that odd year cycle. So 2017 was a really bad year for white mold, and those sclerotia, they survive in the soil for up to 10 years. So 2017, 2019, 2021, we're back into rotation on some of those fields that have, likely high pressure this year. So I would strongly suggest making a plan, maybe looking back at yield data or notes from 2017, looking at those fields where you've had high instances of white mold and coming up with a kind of a comprehensive plan. So if anyone has any questions, this was a really broad topic and hard to keep short, but just reach out to me and I'll do my best to steer you in the right direction. Thanks.